All right, Reconstruction. Reconstruction, and talk about the era of Reconstruction that happened just after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877. This was an attempt to transform the former Confederate states, transform the South, bring them back into the Union politically, as well as materially, industrially. As you can see, in the South was pretty much destroyed. You can see this old lithograph kind of thing there. The South was fairly well burned up. We'll talk about that a little bit later. This Reconstruction, it included the Civil Rights Amendments. If you remember, civil rights deal with groups of people, whereas the individual rights, Bill of Rights mostly deals with individual rights that you as a person might have. Civil rights deal with groups, race-based, gender-based, that type of thing. So the first of the Civil Rights Amendments, abolishing slavery, 1865, is 13th Amendment. For those of you who don't know your Roman numerals, X11, that's 10 and 3 1s. Says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So no slavery in Puerto Rico. However, most people forget to read that second clause saying except as punishment for a crime. This is how prisoners are able to be paid 8 cents a day for the work that they do inside of a prison. It's kind of a de facto involuntary servitude. All right, Amendment 14, 14th Amendment, former slaves receive citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. This is a questionably constitutionally worded clause that has not been properly challenged in the court system. This is how we end up with people crossing the border illegally just to have babies. There's actually an entire tourism industry built around people coming to the United States in order to give birth so that their children could have citizenship, US citizenship. Because of all persons born in the United States. There's some question about this jurisdiction thereof. It's an ongoing question, hasn't reached the court system yet. All male citizens receive the vote. Oh, back up a minute. All male citizens receive the vote. 1870, that's the 15th Amendment. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the question here is, citizens can vote, but only male citizens can vote. So we're women citizens until the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. That's a question kind of lost to history, as it can't be answered now because the 19th Amendment provided the right to vote to women as a civil right. All right, Lee's and Grant's terms. If you remember from the reading or from last week's lecture, Lee was surrounded at Petersburg. They engaged in trench warfare. It was sort of a siege. Lee escaped out of there, bounced down, got chased by Grant, ended up at Appomattox, where Lee formally surrendered to Grant. This is Lee and Grant sitting down together here for that surrender. These were very generous terms that Grant gave down. The first thing they did when they got there was they talked about their old Army days back in the Mexican-American War, where they served together. And once they became reacquainted with each other on friendly terms, Grant issued the terms. As long as the soldiers laid down their arms, they would be granted parole. The Army or the officers in the artillery, they got to keep their horses. Lee pointed out that his soldiers hadn't eaten in about 3 days. So Grant gave them rations, issued, I think it was some 30 to 50,000 rations to the soldiers that Grant provided these soldiers. And then if the soldiers going home needed transportation, they had to go through federally occupied territory. They were provided transportation at no cost. Very, very generous terms. Not really terms that were given to any prisoners of war or a defeated nation. Remember, these are prisoners of war at this time because they are a defeated army, and the parole granted them free passage home, released them from their prisoner status, and said they could go home. No harm, no foul. Very generous. All right, Ford Theater. Lincoln was shot. This kind of a picture of Ford Theater's mock-up recreation. I think these are wax statues, wax figures here, full size. You can go to this place and check it out. Anyway, it was originally a kidnapping plot. John Wilkes Booth and his buddies, sympathetic to the Confederate cause, were going to kidnap Lincoln and his cabinet. The original intent was to re-energize, boost the morale of the Confederate soldiers so that they would fight harder. But Booth saw Lincoln giving a speech where he said he would give freed slaves citizenship, which was already a thing. But that angered Booth, and he turned into a assassination plot. His compatriots, his conspirators, fellow conspirators, for whatever reason, they couldn't finish the plot. They ended up getting arrested. Booth was the only one to carry out his part of the plan, assassinating President Lincoln, and then running away, only caught later on. Andrew Johnson, if you remember from the biographies, Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president. He was a Southern Democrat. They ran on a unity ticket. Lincoln was a Northern Republican. Johnson was a Southern Democrat. However, Johnson was not sympathetic to the Confederate cause. He was sympathetic to the South. He took over after Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson became president. He considered Reconstruction rehabilitation. He considered the Southern states to have been in rebellion, but not fully their own nation. Once they were brought back into the house, so to speak, they didn't have to reapply for citizenship. They could just be let in, and as part of the 10% plan here, once 10% of that population pledged loyalty to the Union, federal control over that state would cease, and it would be given back to the states for their own governance. This may or may not have been a good idea. Congress wanted a majority. They wanted at least 50% of the state to pledge, 50% of the population of the state to pledge loyalty. But Johnson insisted only on 10%. Now, if you're having a party and 90% of the people at your party don't want to be at your party, you don't have much of a party. So this may, originally being generous, it may have caused problems later on, as it didn't require everybody to come back in full faith. And then he offered amnesty to anybody who would pledge loyalty to the United States. They would be absolved of any kind of war crimes that they may have committed or anything like that, which again, is going to cause some problems. May or may not. All right, carpetbaggers, scallywags. I have been called a carpetbagger myself. What a carpetbagger was, the carpet bags were, the luggage at the time was made out of scraps of carpet. You know, your suitcase would be made out of it. Cut up your carpet, make a suitcase out of it, that kind of thing. The carpetbaggers were Northern Reconstructionists who moved south. And in doing so, moving south, they were telling the South how to live, how to work, how to move into modernity, into the modern age. When I was called a carpetbagger, it was very direct, and I quote, "Well, that's not the way my daddy did it. That's not the way my daddy's daddy do it." and that's not the way I'm going to do it. And I don't need no carpetbagger coming down here and telling me how to do it. And I was like, all right, whatever, just fix my Jeep, right? Um, that's all it was. He was fixing my Jeep, and I knew my Jeep. I just didn't have the tools to fix it, and I was telling him how to do it, and he didn't like that I was telling him how to do it. Anyway, got called a carpetbagger. It is still an insult today, 160 years later. All right, the Scallywags, they were Southerners who sided with Reconstruction. And the reason these were considered insults and bad people was because they were viewed as people who were looking to increase their own personal political position or monetary position. They were looking for money, basically, is the way the other people saw these people moving in and siding with the North after the war. All right, Georgia after Sherman, if you remember Sherman's wheel and his march to the sea from your reading, he really destroyed Georgia along the way, and then he swung north up through the Carolinas. On that way, he burned plantations and pillaged farms. Pillage means looting, means stealing from. Sherman himself, he issued orders that the farms were to be left intact, that the soldiers, according to the laws of warfare at the time, they could take food that they needed, but they had to stay out of the homes. Well, the soldiers didn't listen to it, and Sherman looked the other way as the soldiers looted the farms. They would go in there and they would swipe anything of value, gold, silver, silverware, plates, anything that could be sold off, they took. And of course, that left all those farmers and plantation owners poor, penniless, because they didn't have any more wealth, right? And along the way, they destroyed the railroads. He actually had people out there with crowbars pulling up railroad ties in order to destroy these things. So after the war, the way that left Georgia was in a pretty bad state. Prior to the war, they were pumping out something like 700,000 bales of cotton. After the war, they could only produce about 50,000 bales of cotton. So their production had decreased incredibly. They didn't have any men to fight, or they didn't have any men left after the war to plant or harvest. They didn't have any railroads to put the harvest on, and then they didn't have anywhere to take it because their ports were wrecked too. So it left Georgia in a pretty devastated state. In that, there was an attempt to spread the industrial society south. Now, spreading industry, building factories where there were none, normally seen as a good idea. However, this was a very disruptive event for the entire social climate of the South. It moved it from an agrarian, meaning farmland, into a more urban centered, meaning city centered. And that was the whole tension between the North and the South to begin with, from way back, even before the Revolutionary War. There was tension between the northern colonies and the southern colonies. If you remember that lesson from way back when, northern, middle, and southern colonies. The northern was manufacturers, industrialized, and the South was still farmers, plantation-based farming. And they sold cash crops. They didn't even have food crops. They weren't growing foodstuffs. They were growing like cotton and tobacco and hemp, which is another way to make cloth and rope, especially. Not a whole lot of food. In doing so, that created a divide between the working class and the middle class. The working class were working in the farms. The middle class were the merchants. This picture here is the rise of the merchant class. You see storefronts right next to the docks. It wasn't really the way. Merchant class were more or less despised at the time, prior to the war, because they were just middlemen. They didn't produce anything. They didn't own land. They just took from the people that produced it and then sold it to other people. They made their money off of transporting goods, basically. So the merchants were kind of despised, but at this point during Reconstruction, they were moving up into the middle class, and the working class, the poor who had no farms to go back to, or who couldn't work the farms anymore, were moving into the factories, and it created a big social divide, which still kind of exists today in a lot of places. All right, if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments.